So this video is about linear time and the fact that linear time is an illusion. I think it's probably the hardest concept known to mankind because 24/7, cradle to grave, we're immersed in linear time. And so it is so much part of our intuition that it's almost impossible to be able to understand how it can be that linear time is an illusion. So it brings about questions that people have, such as what came before the Big Bang? Whereas in fact that is an illogical question, because the Big Bang isn't a linear time event, and 2021, which is obviously way after the Big Bang in terms of linear time, is also not a linear time event that has progressed 13.8 billion years from the assumed event, the Big Bang. To illustrate this, start with more simple examples, and one is if you imagine a spaceship visiting the time of the dinosaurs, and they mingled with the dinosaurs, but then took a journey away at 99.99999% the speed of light, and they travelled for several months, but returned back to the Earth. We know from special relativity from Einstein that there is time dilation, and that the clocks that are experienced on board the ship are incredibly slow by comparison to the time that passes for the non-travelling entities. What this means is that when they return back, they could be arriving back at 2021, having only aged very little themselves. But of course, they can go and visit dinosaur bones in the National History Museum, which would seem to indicate the dinosaurs at the time they visited originally were many millions of years ago. Now, if a similar spacecraft were to travel at 99.9999999% the speed of light, and they had been around the Earth as it was forming, then they would see the Earth evolve from its inception to current time happen in a very, very short space of time from their perspective, such that when they returned, for them hardly any time will have passed, but obviously from the Earth perspective it's gone from its inception all the way to current date. Now if you go one step further and consider the position of a photon, it means that at the speed of light, its clock effectively does not pass at all. There is no distance experienced and no time elapses. So therefore, the whole of what was described from the inception of the Earth to current date didn't take 1 second from its perspective, didn't take a nanosecond. It actually took 0 time. And this obviously is where the mind is not particularly well adapted to understanding the consequences of that, because it means that 0 time has occurred, and yet we're also aware through evidence that there has been a whole set of evolution. Multiple different creatures have come so many millions of years into the life of the Earth, leading up to the current time where it has evolved to mankind, etc., with countless generations moving from cradle to grave. So it creates an incredible paradox, because how can you have, on the one hand, 0 time, and on the other hand, the elapsing of time, which has allowed for so much evolution and change? The point being is that when you realise that the position of the photon is correct, it actually means evolution itself cannot be, because evolution requires linear time. So what's going on? What it actually means is that because of mind, which is a non-local consciousness phenomenon, it is possible to solve this paradox, whereby there are multiple happenings that occur, or life circumstances, and yet at the same time they occur as a singular infinite moment. Now, if we take a look at someone like Hitler, from our perspective, he was a historical figure. But the truth is, every moment he, let's say, was alive, from cradle to grave, is actually all at once. But here's the difficult part to grasp, because his focus of attention and limited free will still created the narrative that forms part of the global narrative. In other words, even though each particular moment of his life was an all-at-once phenomenon, it was still created through non-local consciousness, as in him as a point of consciousness, to create that narrative. So even though we're looking at it as though it's the past, every single part of the build-up of that life within the agreed-upon hallucination we call reality is an all-at-once event. So this explains what's going on, but what is the evidence for this? Well, the first thing that should always happen before considering any scientific or philosophical phenomena is to consider the fact that regardless of your views, opinions or beliefs on the kind of reality that we are in, for example, materialism, physicalism, idealism, regardless of that, each person would agree in terms of their consciousness that they perceive human beings with a skull and with a brain, and that the brain sits within the skull and it sits in pure darkness, and that any of the information that it gains from an apparent out there is encoded information that is decoded and actually creates a model of the world through consciousness. And therefore it is obvious, because the map is never the same as the territory, that what is created as a mind's eye model, which is our screen of perception, is something that is agreed amongst many different conscious agents, as in humans, but by the same token, it is not the world in of itself, because clearly a non-passive mind creates that field of perception, or that screen of perception. So that's the starting point, is to realize that what you see, feel and touch and smell may feel intuitively to be out there, whereas in fact that is only an assumption. So the actual evidence regarding the fact we are all non-local consciousness starts with entanglement in quantum mechanics, whereby twin particles, when they're separated at huge distances, when one is impacted through measurement, instantaneous effect occurs, whereby the other particle reacts. Now, the limit for communication and for the speed at which it can occur is light speed. And quite clearly, this is being ignored in the phenomenon of entanglement. This is very telling, because it indicates that perception creates the space-time between those 2 points, but in actual fact it cannot be there, because it would be impossible for instantaneous reaction. Einstein felt that this was evidence of hidden variables, but Bell's inequality mathematically showed that he was wrong, and that was an incorrect assumption, and experiments have gone on to prove the mathematics to be true, which means that there really is spooky action at a distance, and the reason is because the perceived space and time between those 2 points is actually created as a perception phenomenon. Another example is in the deferred choice double slit experiment, and how that also creates a reality based on intent that ignores space-time in how it propagates, and modern day Libet experiments to do with when you lift a finger and when the volition and the feeling of volition occurs shows similarly markers within what's called the readiness potential before the volition feeling, that there is time encoding in neuronal activity which actually occurs after the gap itself, and so is forming the experience in space-time. Likewise, special relativity, which is what governs the phenomenon with the dinosaurs I discussed, shows us that an 8-minute 20-second journey of a photon from the sun to the eye, from the photon's perspective, is zero time and zero distance, and again is showing us that the perception of space-time, where we see it being 8 minutes and 20, is actually something that is irrelevant from the photon's perspective. And likewise, general relativity, when you have infinite mass, this equates to infinite acceleration, and that is the same as light speed. And as we know, at light speed, there is no linear time. So therefore, the evidence is already there to show that linear time is an illusion, despite our intuition. And so even though it's a fairly complex subject, and even though it's intuitive that linear time is a real phenomenon, hopefully you've now gained a better understanding and can see how the illusion is created.